Nicholas Kristof and Jan Karski. Both have made a difference, sources of light in dark times. As Karski illuminates the quality of Kristof's achievements, and as Kristof honors the legacy of Karski. And as I have the great pleasure to present tonight's honoree, Nicholas Kristof.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm really delighted to be here, flattered to be here. I also just want to start by thanking and introducing my wife, who is here, who's been very much a partner in my efforts in book writing and news writing. And when I go travel into a war zone, then it's often hardest on the family left behind. So let me introduce Cheryl. I'm really appreciative and flattered by this, not only because Jan Karski was one of the great figures of the 20th century, not only because I have Polish roots. Kristof originated as Kristofowicz, but maybe above all because Karski, in a sense, is a story of uplift. And at this time, we really need it. He's a story of uplift at a particularly grim time in our history. I'm regularly asked how it is that I manage to cover issues like war, genocide, human trafficking, poverty, and remain pretty upbeat. And the answer is that invariably, side by side with the worst of humanity, you find the very best. And that was true in World War II. We tend to think of World War II in terms of Hitler. World War II was also Jan Karski. It was also the incredible Witold Pilecki, who sneaked into Auschwitz to help get the word out. And this is something that I have just been bowled over again and again in my reporting. I remember one time I was in Congo, which is the most lethal conflict since World War II. And I interviewed a warlord who had been busy massacring and raping people. But maybe the person who left the deepest impression on me on that visit was this little old Polish nun who had been in Eastern Congo for more than 20 years. And when all the aid workers there were evacuated, she stayed behind. She was single-handedly running a school, an orphanage, an emergency feeding center. And just as the warlord indicated or reflected the human capacity for evil, she reflected the human capacity for courage and resilience and altruism. And I've got to say, I came back from Eastern Congo feeling better about humanity and kind of wanting to grow up and become a Polish nun. I remember likewise in covering Darfur, I have recollections of terrible things that I saw. But one of the people who left a particularly deep impression on me was a woman called Saada. She was in a camp for displaced people. And I was trying to gather stories. It turned out that she and her younger sister, her 15-year-old sister, had been out gathering firewood outside the camp. They had seen the Janjaweed militia approaching. And Saada told her sister Halima, run for the camp. And then she made a distraction of herself and ran the other way. And the Janjaweeds saw her, they caught up with her, they brutally beat her, and 8 of them gang raped her. And she told me this story, and one of the challenges in journalism is how do you get informed consent to use stories? It's much more powerful if you can use a name, if you can use a photo, a video, but that risks getting people in trouble. It risks stigmatizing people. And so you obviously need consent, but how do you get informed consent from a Darfuri peasant who doesn't know what the New York Times is, what the internet is? And so I was asking her, why she agreed and why it is that she was saying to use her picture and this kind of thing. And she said something that I will never forget, that I want to do this because this is the only tool I have to fight back. And so I think of that kind of courage that she displayed and that I've seen in so many of these other humanitarian crises all over the map. And it's those people who are the real Jan Karskis out there, and you see them in every conflict around the world. I want to offer just a few provocations, if you will, and reflections. I mean, one thing that I've wondered about is why in the 1930s and 1940s we in this country did not respond when Karski came, when we heard through other means about what was happening. Why didn't we take refugees? When a ship of refugees, mostly Jewish refugees, arrives and sees the lights of Miami, why do we turn it back and send it back to Europe to have people die in the Holocaust? And I think that there are some lessons that maybe are relevant to today. I think that one reason we did not respond better is this incredible human capacity we have to otherize people who are different from ourselves. And we can otherize people based on race or religion or immigration status or whatever it may be. And I think, and the second thing is that when we're scared, we make bad decisions. And in the 1930s and 40s, we were scared. And that made it easier to turn people away, to otherize, to show less compassion or empathy. And likewise, I think today, we are scared of terrorism, of violence, and I think in that context, it becomes easier to otherize refugees or Muslims or people who are undocumented or people of different races, whatever it may be. There are a few areas, I think, that if Karski were alive, where he would hope to see more U.S. leadership on international issues. And one is conflicts around the world that involve mass atrocities or even genocide. One looks at Syria, of course. One looks at South Sudan, Yemen, where we are supporting a coalition that is, frankly, engaging in war crimes. And I think that one of the constraints here, and as I said, this is a provocation, I'm sure plenty of you will agree, but I think that one of the challenges is that after the Iraq War and Afghanistan, that we've internalized the idea that the military toolbox is useless. And this is, I think, especially true in liberal circles. I say that as a liberal who opposed the Iraq War, who opposed the Afghan surge, who tends to be allergic to military intervention. And yet, I do think that that toolbox can be used at times for humanitarian reasons. And I'd say that as 250,000 people in eastern Aleppo face an onslaught today, I think that there is more we can do and that the military toolbox should be examined for options. There are all kinds of proposals for sort of mini versions of no-fly zones, in effect to ground the Syrian Air Force, not to challenge the Russian Air Force, but if I don't think Russia wants to be Syria's Air Force, and to try to ground Syria's Air Force who at least can't drop barrel bombs. It's not perfect. Could it mitigate the problems? Perhaps. A second area, aside from those conflicts, mass atrocities, is refugees. We have 60 million people around the world who are displaced by war and conflict. 60 million, the greatest number since the aftermath of World War II. Syrians are maybe the best example of that. And the solution is not to admit every Syrian. The most crucial thing one can do is to help address the forces that are propelling people away. The second thing one has to do a much better job of is to support those refugees in surrounding countries, especially in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. 200,000 Syrian kids right now in Lebanon are not able to go to school. If you're a Syrian parent who loves your children and your kids are in Lebanon and can't go to school, then you will do what you can to get them to Europe or America so that they can have an education and a future. And education is something that is cheap, that we know how to do. Syria is hard. Getting Syrian kids in Lebanon in school is something we absolutely can do if we have the will. Canada is an interesting contrast to the US. In the US, it's been immensely controversial to admit a total of 11,000 Syrian refugees so far. 11,000. It's less than 1% of the number that Lebanon has taken. Canada has already taken more than 30,000, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau essentially, I mean, there were uncertainties within Canada, but he showed leadership, moral leadership, political leadership. He went to the airport with winter jackets to hand them out to Syrians who were arriving, and he made it a Canadian source of pride to show that they are part of the solution to an international crisis. That was, I think, the best kind of leadership, and I think we can, in this country, we can learn from it. And I think the third area that Karski might be engaged in today, where he would hope to see greater leadership, is in the struggle against global poverty, hunger, disease. Almost 1/4 of children around the world today suffer from stunting because of malnutrition. Almost 1/4. And while we measure stunting in terms of physical measurements, the greatest disability from that is cognitive, that the same malnutrition that reduces your height also reduces your cognitive capacity for the rest of your life. And again, this is something, a lot of international problems are pretty hard. Stunting is something we know how to address. There is this perception that global poverty disease is hopeless. 90% of Americans say that global poverty is either worsening or staying the same. In fact, it's been one of the great successes of the modern world. Since 1990, the number of people living in extreme poverty has dropped by more than half. The number of children dying before the age of 5 has dropped by more than half. Some diseases like guinea worm and polio are on the way out. And I think we psych ourselves out sometimes when we are on the cusp. I mean, in our lifetimes, we will eliminate extreme poverty, the situation in which most humans have lived for the entire history of humanity. When I was in college, 44% of the world population lived in extreme poverty. Holding it for inflation, the number is just below 10% today. Another 15 years, it'll be down to below 3%. This is an extraordinary time, and I don't think we're fully engaged in that fight, in that struggle. And lastly, I want to leave you with a challenge. It's hard to get these issues addressed, whether we're talking about the Holocaust or Darfur or refugees or global poverty, unless they're getting attention. And as a journalist, I deeply believe in the capacity of the media to help keep these issues in the foreground. I'm also deeply disappointed that we in the media haven't done a better job on many of these issues. But I also want to be blunt. If you think we haven't done a good enough job on keeping these issues in the forefront in the last 15 years, and I would share that view, then I'm afraid it's going to be even worse in the next 15. The challenge is that the business model for much of the news media is collapsing. And if you're an executive producer of a TV show, you can send a camera crew off to try to cover the refugee crisis, to try to cover what's happening in Aleppo. And your ratings will drop compared to a rival channel that puts a Democrat and a Republican in a studio together and has them yell at each other. That's the fundamental constraint we face. One of the things that I found particularly depressing followed an effort at trying to have foundations provide a business model. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation essentially bribed ABC News to cover important global issues. It wasn't called a bribe, it was called a grant. And it was controversial within the development community, because why should Bill and Melinda Gates be using scarce resources not to vaccinate kids, but to pay television executives at ABC to do their jobs? But in fact, ABC did a terrific job with the Gates money. They did fabulous stories on maternal health, on micronutrients, on hunger. And so the Gates Foundation went back after a year and said, we'd like to renew our grant. And ABC News said, no, we don't want to take your money, because we can see from our metrics that when we air these important stories, that's when viewers switch the channel. In that context, I think it's going to be really hard to get adequate attention on some of these global crises. We in the media have to do a better job. You've got to hold our feet to the fire, hold us to account, to encourage us to do so. But my challenge to all of you is that you all have your own spotlights in one form or another. It's your Facebook page, it's your book club, it's your dinner table conversation. And I hope that if we in the news media end up dropping the ball in the coming years, that all of you will help pick it up. Because unless we keep these issues in front of us, they're just not going to get addressed any more today than they were in 1942 with Jan Karski. Thanks very much. I'm really honored to be here.
So this is a formal ceremony. Hopefully, Nick will be able to hang this in the most prominent spot in his office. The award reads, Jan Karski Educational Foundation presents the Spirit of Jan Karski Award to Nicholas Kristof for his unflagging efforts to draw public attention to humanitarian issues around the world through his passionate reporting and powerful writing.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.